Creek Bridge. It's a fascinating story that really inspired my writing when I was going to school, so yeah, I hope you'll enjoy it. Ambrose Bierce, born June 24th, 1842, born in Ohio, and he died January 1914 in Mexico. Big question mark there.
Yeah, I was going to say, apparently.
He was an American newspaperman, wit, satirist, and author of sardonic short stories based on themes of death and horror and the supernatural. His life ended apparently in Mexico in an unsolved mystery. That's important to remember here. Reared in Indiana, Bierce became a printer's devil. That's an apprentice on a Warsaw, Indiana paper after about a year in high school. So from a very young age, interested in journalism, newspapers and writing, publishing. In 1861, he enlisted in the 19th Indiana Volunteers and fought in a number of American Civil War battles, including Shiloh and Chickamauga. After being seriously wounded by a headshot in the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain in 1864, he served until January 1865, and he received a merit of promotion to a major in 1867. So after his time in the war, he resettled in San Francisco. San Francisco,
Yep.
Here we go. There's a theme tonight coming up. This is meant to be.
Yeah.
Which was experiencing an artistic renaissance. Bierce began contributing to periodicals, particularly the Newsletter, of which he became an editor in 1868. He was soon the literary arbiter of the West Coast. This guy was big time. He could make you or break you. He was literally a kingmaker. The Haunted Valley was his first short story. In December of 1871, he married Mary Ellen Day, and from 1872 to 1875, the Bierces lived in England. He traveled across the pond, where he wrote for the London magazines Fun and Figaro, big papers at the time in particular Western Europe. He edited The Lantern for the exiled French Empress Eugenie and published 3 books: The Friend's Delight, Nuggets and Dustpan Out in California, and my favorite, Cobwebs from an Empty Skull. In 1877, he became an associate editor of the San Francisco Argonaut, but left it in 1880 for an unsuccessful try at placer mining in Rockerville in the Dakota Territory. Thereafter, he was the editor of the San Francisco Illustrated Wasp for 5 years. In 1887, he joined the William Randolph Hearst's San Francisco Examiner, for which he wrote the Prattler column. This is where he would make you or break you if he didn't like you. You wouldn't want to be on his bad side, that's for sure. In 1896, Bierce moved to Washington, D.C., where he continued newspaper and magazine writing. In 1913, tired of American life, he went to Mexico, then in the middle of a revolution led by Pancho Villa. Bierce's fate is a mystery, but a reasonable conjecture is that he was killed in the siege of Ojinaji in January 1914. But there's many stories as to what possibly happened to him. Bierce separated from his wife, lost his 2 sons, and broke many friendships over the course of his career. As a newspaper columnist, he specialized in critical attacks on poets, clergymen, bores, dishonest politicians, money grubbers, pretenders, and his favorite to go after, fraudsters. Bierce's principal books are In the Midst of Life, which includes some of his finest stories, such as An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, which I'll be reading tonight, A Horseman in the Sky, The Eyes of a Panther, The Boarded Window, Can Such Things Be, which includes The Damn Thing, and Moxon's Master. Bierce is the Devil's Dictionary, originally published in 1906 as the Cynic's Words Book, is a volume of ironic, even bitter definitions that have often been reprinted. His collected works was published in 12 volumes, 1909 to 1912, includes his 2 books of poetry. The Enlarged Devil's Dictionary first appeared in 1967. A Soul Survivor, Bits of Autobiography, edited by Joshi and Schultz, was published in 1998. And A Much Misunderstood Man, Selected Letters of Ambrose Bierce, which are always fascinating, reading people's letters from the past. Gives you a real insight, especially back then. Letter writing, as we know, was kind of a 9-yard. Not too many people write letters anymore. But back then, people really, it was literally an opening into their soul when you read people's letters back then, because they were such profound thoughts and beliefs and values. So it's a fascinating book. I've read some of his letters, just fascinating individual. So, I was introduced to Ambrose Bierce by a mentor of mine, Dr. Marvin Singleton. I met Dr. Marvin Singleton when I was starting my journey post-secondary, which came later in life for me. I was in my early 30s when I started that. And Dr. Marvin Singleton was a fascinating individual. He'd been a Fulbright professor in the University of Oslo after World War II in the 1950s. Came back to the US, he's from the US. After his time in Oslo, he came back and taught creative writing at different universities in the US. And I met him through a friend in Nelson, BC, where he retired. He was in his early 80s. And Marvin took a shine to me and mentored me in my early days of writing, introduced me to a lot of these fascinating short story writers, Ambrose Bierce being one of them. And Ambrose Bierce he was kind of like a Hemingway-like figure in the sense that he was a war veteran, he was a journalist, he was a short story writer, and most of all, he was an adventurer, like Hemingway. And Hemingway was really inspired by individuals of the past, these American adventurers and journalists and real men's men at the time, right? And I loved Hemingway as well. He introduced me to Hemingway as well. But one of the things that I like about Ambrose Bierce the most is that he called it like he saw it. And back then in journalism, like letter writing, good journalism is a dying art, right? It's so politicized now, it's so biased, but not personal bias. It's more politically biased than it is personally biased. And one thing that I really admired about him is that he didn't pull any punches. He called it like he saw it. And back then you could do that, you know what I mean? You didn't have to rely on money from this person or money from that organization or that news agency. And so he was a real free spirit journalist, right? He wasn't beholden to anyone. He called it like he saw it. And if you were a fraudster and you were someone who took advantage of other people, he would go after you, he'd take you down. He was kind of like an anti-hero, right? I always like those anti-hero types, you know what I mean? Like, whether it's James Bond or Conan the Barbarian or, Ambrose Bierce, right? So, there's something admirable about that, for me anyway. But we're going to swing back to his unsolved disappearance, his unsolved death.